day, by the way. Mr. Andre Ebanks, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Mic check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly fine.
Well, good
Thank you
morning to
so much.
you. Good morning to you and your viewers, Cayman and Caymanians overseas that may be listening around the world.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you yourself have lived in the UK, and I'm sure that that was a very interesting experience for you. Now, I know you want to spend a little bit of time this morning sort of speaking freely before we start getting into any questions about, parts of your manifesto, what your vision is, why you've decided to run for office. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And then we're going to get into some questions that we have for you, as well as some audience questions.
Sure. If I could start by saying happy International Women's Day. It's a time to celebrate women's achievements and also to move forward the gender equality agenda in a meaningful way. So while there have been some achievements, there is now scope to improve matters even further. And it goes beyond just, say, violence and discrimination. It's also the subtle matters in terms of equal pay, sexual harassment, and not just in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace. In terms of practices, family leave, there are a whole lot of subtle issues that still need to be addressed. And although we've taken large steps forward as a country with the gender equality law, and also the extension of the UN Convention, CEDAW, to the Cayman Islands in 2016. There's still more work to be done, but at the same time, we do have to celebrate our achievements. So happy International Women's Day to all women, and in particular, my former gender equality warriors. And I think that might provide a useful launch pad, because the 2021 theme of International Women's Day is I Choose to Challenge, which is interesting and has a synergy with my reason for stepping forward and standing for election. It's akin to the sentiments I expressed at our launch meeting on Thursday of last week, that although I had a good job, a very honorable job in representing these islands in the UK and in the EU and Europe, it became a point, an inflection point, whereby after doing the role for 18 months, and part of that was living in UK lockdown, and I can describe a little bit of that later. But then coming home after that time and being really proud of the work that was done in the UK in terms of grappling with the implications of Brexit on behalf of the country. We were also on an EU tax list, involved in removal of that list, and then also the impact of COVID in terms of Caymanians overseas who were either trapped in the UK and needed to get home, or vice versa, once they've gotten home, needed to return. So there was a good, solid body of work there to be proud of. And I think the government also should be commended for the manner in which it handled COVID. Once we landed as a family and got out of quarantine, you could marvel at things that you just couldn't do in the UK. Just simple things of just being able to go to the grocery store quite freely, to be able to mingle with friends and family over Christmas. So that we do have to count our blessings. But at the same time, after leaving quarantine and returning, even though we counted those blessings, I got the sense that Cayman is a real shining star in the region, and you can see that externally. But internally, there's a lot of work to do. And so I came to a point where a crisis of conscience happened, and I thought I could continue and return to the UK and continue good work on behalf of the country, or do I really look inside myself and decide to choose the challenge, the status quo, and not accept events the way that they are, and deal with some of the deep-rooted issues that I believe that COVID has brought more to the forefront. Arguably, a number of these issues were already in existence, but I think they have been brought to bear by COVID. And I thought to myself, this may be a time, notwithstanding whoever else may be challenging for the West Bay South seat, whoever else might be in any other seat, that it's a time where I think the country needs to have the most qualified, experienced people possible to work in a collaborative way to solve our country's problems. And with that, my wife and I prayed. We
Mm-hmm.
thought to ourselves, what were the logistical steps to actually do this? And we had lots to think about. Because as I mentioned on Thursday, we were packed and ready to go on the 6th of January. But then we had to think, all right, to make sure that this isn't all pie in the sky, what would we really
Mm-hmm.
have to do this? We'd have to get the kids back into school. We would have to buy clothes because we only came with a bit of clothes for Christmas holiday. We'd have to discuss with my employer what the leaving terms, and London is an important post, and I wouldn't want to leave the office in a lurch. So we had to have those conversations, but we thought if along the way any of those presented a red light, then it's a sign from the Lord that this isn't your time. But as we
Mm-hmm.
move through that logistical checklist and we just continue to see the doors open, we took it as a sign that the Lord has said, at least give yourself this opportunity to stand and to choose to challenge. And that's how I arrive here today.
Well, thank you, Andre, for that bit of background information. I think it certainly is helpful. I was actually at your meeting on Thursday, and I think a lot of people were able to view the live stream on our platform as well. The last time I checked, it had, oh gosh, I want to say at least 6,000 views. I think a number of people definitely got to see it. One of the questions, and as I say that, I see that, this question has popped up by Lana Farrington, that people are asking the exact same question. So you mentioned that this was a bit of a last minute decision for you. And out of that, I think people obviously know that around the same time that you made a decision to step back and return to the Cayman Islands with your family and enter into the political arena, Tara Rivers, there seems to be a coincidence in timing, decided to not run. She hadn't officially announced it as yet. But of course, we know that at least a week before she had her press conference, we knew that it was coming. We actually did a story on the fact that it was coming. We also knew before you sort of did, your official resignation that you would be resigning and seeking political office. So, this is came out, Andre. People are always talking. We like to set the record straight here on the hardcore truth. So there is this rumor in circulation that you have been sort of handpicked by the progressives, and you are, Tara's designated replacement for West Bay South. And so I want to give you, whatever opportunity you need this morning to clarify this rumor. Where do you think the rumor comes from? And most importantly, is it true or is it not true? Have you had any discussions with the progressives or the CDP? Did they in any way encourage you to run for political office or offer their support?
So the rumor is not true,
Okay.
categorically. I think where the rumor comes from, if I have to put myself in other folks' shoes,
Mm-hmm.
it does seem strange that my candidacy sort of came out of nowhere, and I get that.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was on the outside looking in, not even just being Cayman, any country, you would look at the facts and say, well, why would he come out now? This seems a bit peculiar.
Mm-hmm.
All I can tell you is those other factors are out of my control. Things happen in life that coincide. The deep-rooted passion in me started well in December, before I knew anything about Minister Rivers' plans. The only thing that I'd heard, just even before I came to Cayman, you kind of had keeping your eyes, I do in my posts, of what the political landscape would look like, because that's part of the role. Would know who had already stepped forward, but none of that entered into my thinking. I'll be very honest with your viewers now. It came about, the seed was planted. We were having dinner, and I won't
Mm-hmm.
call their names, with two senior civil servants and their spouses. And we got into this engaging discussion after Christmas about all the things that we would like to see and do differently. And the end
Mm-hmm.
of the conversation was, okay, but at the end of the day, a civil servant can only take things so far. You're the policy advisor. You're not the policy maker. So the
Mhm.
dinner table was split between folks who said, well, no, as a civil servant, you can still be there as the guardrails. That's
Mhm.
important. You have a permanent pensionable job, you succeed government, and you're there to advise. The other half of the table thought, but if we continue to think that way, and people who understand how government actually works, how to work with the civil servants, don't step forward, then how will the things that we are concerned about ever change? And
Mhm.
that spontaneous conversation, remember now, we were just there to just relax and have fun over Christmas and let the kids play, but we couldn't
Mhm.
help it. We got into a very engaging conversation, and that seed is what troubled me. And
Mhm.
then decided to say, look, which is why it went with my campaign theme song. I ended up forming the view on the other side of the table that if
Mhm.
we all just sit back and no one takes a step forward, then
Mhm.
nothing that we're concerned about ever changes. So at least try. And I did that blindly of what anybody else's plans were.
Mhm.
The challenge for me was to think about now, which goes to the root of your question. What will folks make of this? But I can't help that. All I can
Mhm.
do is say that I put my best foot forward, and I'm standing in a very independent, unaffiliated way. To answer your question about communication, I think just about all of the different political groupings wanted to call me to just confirm the rumor that they'd heard I was running. And they wanted to know whether it was a serious decision. And I told all of them the same thing that I'll tell your viewers today.
Mhm.
When they called, I said, this is me. This doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody else in terms of Minister Rivers, whether a current opponent is in, whether anybody else popped up before nomination day. This is something that's deeply inside Andre Ebanks, who has a conviction, who wants to put forward a case for election and let the voters evaluate. I don't plan to talk to anybody else in terms of talk about anybody else. I want to keep it very issues based, and this
Mhm.
has nothing to do with any other candidate. And yes, it's a serious consideration, and I left it at that. Now, fast forward, it's obvious from post nomination, I'm definitely in, but those were the
Right.
conversations. And I should actually make another point there that when I
Sure.
went about that journey to can't do it alone, you need folks to support you. And every member of my committee that I approached one on one, it was a meeting of the minds. I didn't even have to convince them that we want to go about this in an independent, unaffiliated way. So there are folks at the table. If my campaign committee was an elected government, it would be a coalition because there are folks there who are PPM, C4C, former UDP, and just former independents. And all of us came away with the views that we need to put all of that to the side, put
Mhm.
forward our best and minds to the table to try to get good work done for the country.
Okay. Were you ever a member of the Progressives?
Yes. And in 2013, the 2013 election,
Mhm.
2012, 2013, you might remember there was a bit of political turbulence around that era.
Mhm.
And that brought about, I think, the creation of C4C. And there
Right.
were a number of, I think, folks my age who wanted to get involved in the system. And at that time, I was in the private sector, so I was working at Walker's, so I wasn't a civil servant. And I went to several meetings. I think I went in the early days to a couple of C4C meetings, listened to what they had to say. Then I went to a few PPM meetings, listened to what they had to say, and
Mhm.
thought it was time for Stand Up for a Change in West Bay, and decided to help the West Bay progressive candidates at the time. So
Mhm.
yes, I was a member in that capacity.
Mhm.
Now,
So
after
you
that,
resigned at that time when C4C came around.
so C4C was coming around and was beginning to form at the time that I was looking to help in some capacity. So it was around the same time. In fact, some
Mhm.
of the same faces were in the same meetings.
Mhm.
And eventually, I think how it bore out was some stayed with C4C, and then some became progressives, and some continued on their own.
Mhm.
I landed with the progressives, and so I was happy with that campaign. I myself at the time thought that I was too junior in my career and too green to know enough about government to put myself forward, but I was happy to help the candidates that I believed in at the time. Fast forward, that election occurred. None of the West Bay progressives were successful, but a number of the other progressives were successful and formed that 2013 government.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, since my wife knew I had some sort of itch for public service, because if you look at my resume, although I was an investment funds lawyer, along the way, I never found it satisfying and my desire for public service. So along the way, I was involved in something civic to
Mm-hmm.
scratch that itch. So whether it was Cayman Airways Board, whether it was the Gender Equality Tribunal, whether it was the Human Rights Committee, whether it was Generation Now, I still had a deeper need for service, but I wasn't ready for electoral politics yet. So my wife had already made the jump. She left KPMG and had a couple of other private sector businesses and became a deputy CFO. And she said, look, you're always behind your desk at Walker's wondering, how did this law get drafted? What was the policy behind this? You do have an itch, but you don't want to step up. I found a job for you that is advertised in the Ministry of Financial Services as a legislative policy advisor. These are the laws you practice every day. If you stop complaining about it, again, it goes back to the theme of 2021. Stop complaining about it and pitch in. And there was real force to that argument. And I thought, nah, maybe she just wants me to work less hours. But she said, no, honestly, yes, you might work less hours, but honestly, really look at the job. And I thought to myself, they'll never want a guy like me. I'll just be there questioning every law that they've written. But the interview turned out to be a real meeting of the minds. They said, look, we do need a practitioner's view, someone that can help us translate what industry is trying to tell us. Is it that they want something to get one by us, or they really do need this? What's the answer? And it fit. And then after that, I completely got the knack for public service, and I had to step away from the PPM to carry out my duties faithfully as a civil servant from 2014. So I landed in the Ministry for Financial Services on November 2014 and had no dealings with the PPM since.
So, one of the things at your meeting that I overheard by way of conversation in the audience, and you talk about the fact that you've got support on your committee from progressives, people, independents, and even CDP members. And I did have a committee member of yours reach out to me on Friday when we were discussing the discourse that was happening amongst some members of your audience, and they said, "Listen, it speaks volumes to Andre's, credibility that all three of these entities, well, they named Tara as an independent, but I think most of us accept that she really wasn't. But they said, Tara and her supporters, progressives, and CDP, and I thought to myself, I'm not so sure that that's a selling point for Andre, because those are the individuals who have put us in the situation that we're in now, even with this coalition government not being able to stand up. Here we are on International Women's Day, and I know you have been involved in advocating on behalf of women. Violence against women is one of the biggest concerns that people have. And here we have a sitting member of the LA, another West Bay MP and Speaker of the House, who attacked a woman violently, unprovoked, at her place of employment. And so the logical question then is, number one, what is your position against violence against women, tied into what would you have done if you were an MP at the time that this incident happened? What would you have called to have been done as it relates to Mr. McKeeva Bush?
Okay, 3 or 4 points there. So one, in terms of those who attend, our committee is trying to attract the broadest cross-section possible and not particular groups. So if particular individuals of different backgrounds come, we can't help that, and we're inviting that because we want the broadest level of support. In relation to violence against women, categorically cannot be stood for. That's a given. And that goes for any person, man, woman, or child, but in particular, women. I can't be a former member of the Gender Equality Tribunal and be for violence for women. I can't be a former Human Rights Committee member and be for violence for women. So that's categorical and obvious. The question about whether or not what would someone have done in relation to Mr. Bush was the last piece of
What
the
would you
question.
have done?
What I've done? Okay.
Yeah, what would
So
you have done?
Okay, I want to say a couple of things there and then answer your question.
Okay.
Number one, I think the overriding issue, because this comes up on the campaign trail, understandably for constituents, is folks want their, again, some feedback. I hope you can still hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Want their members of parliament to uphold a particular standard. And if that standard is not upheld, they would like a consequence drawn from that. So, and I can understand that because in my role as representative to the UK and to Europe, I was acutely aware that any move that I made, any meeting that I turned up into the UK Parliament, any meeting that I had for the EU, I wanted to represent Cayman as strongly, as eloquently, as intelligently, and with as much integrity as possible, because it would be a reflection on the entire country. And I think that is what gets to the root of the question, is folks want their members to uphold certain values. In that situation, I don't think there's going to be a candidate that will not answer the question that if put in that situation and any member of parliament were to conduct themselves in a particular way and be convicted, should hold high office. So that's the easy part. The question now is, what do we do about it prospectively going forward? Because the situation could happen again, which I think is the other part that underlines the question, because people don't want this to happen again. I think, therefore, we should take it as a teachable moment and think, well, what would be the solution? My solution would be that we work together as recommended, but now the Human Rights Commission, which is the successor to the Human Rights Committee. Their research shows that many of our regional countries have a parliamentary code of conduct. I would align myself with the Human Rights Commission's view that we need to implement a parliamentary code of conduct. So when an offense such as what occurred before or any other offense occurs, it is a breach of that code. There's a prescribed procedure that's followed and the appropriate consequence delivered. Otherwise, we could be back here again, and whether or not this comes down to particular politics or dynamics of the time, I think it should be a clear-cut code that follows the prescribed manner and the consequence administered.
Okay, but I'm not clearly hearing a response. I understand what you're saying in terms of the way forward, but in the moment now, if you were an MP, would you have been one of those individuals asking for Mr. Bush's removal as Speaker of the House? Yes or no?
Well, two things. Number one, I think there's a step before that. Any
Okay.
person who had found themselves in inappropriate conduct should voluntarily, in my opinion,
Well, he
any
didn't.
person, the
He
MP,
didn't. He's not
resign.
going to do
Hold on.
that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm talking about you're asking what I would do.
No, I'm saying
So
you was as MP. I mean, you can't control Mr. Bush's behavior,
no.
obviously.
You're asking a hypothetical as an MP what I would do, right?
Right.
So
Yes.
I'm asking the first part. I think there's a first step. As an
Yeah.
MP, if I found myself in that situation, which I pray to God I wouldn't, or any improper conduct, the
No, no, no. I'm
customary.
sorry. You're misunderstanding the question. So let me just
No,
back
no,
up.
no, no. I haven't. No, I haven't. I haven't. I'm getting to
Okay.
your part of the question. I just think
Okay.
there's a preliminary step to not
Okay.
overlook. Is that if I am the MP in the hypothetical who was convicted of improper conduct, my reaction would be to voluntarily resign. Now, if should that measure have failed, which goes to the root of your question, the appropriate measure would have been for a resolution to be brought for that individual, if it were me, for that individual to be returned to the backbench. Unless it was an offense of the Constitution that disqualifies you as a member altogether, which is a different kettle of fish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. No. The hypothetical wasn't if you had done it, but
No,
uh,
but I wanted to make that clear because I think it's an
yeah.
important point, because I
Yeah.
think it's the step that you're talking about arises when the person has not resigned. So I think
Right.
it's an
Right.
important step to make that if I was that person, I would have voluntarily resigned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There was another second part to Lana's question. So she says, what are your thoughts on the performance of Tara on behalf of her constituents and the country in the past 8 years? And what, if anything, would you do differently?
I think in terms of, because I worked under Minister Rivers for a brief period. So when I
Mm-hmm.
was in financial services, I worked firstly for former Minister Wayne Panton. And
Right.
for probably, I think, 2.5 years of his term, and then maybe the first year and a bit of Minister Rivers' term.
Okay.
And I learned a lot from both individuals, and they both had different strengths and different areas of focus. From what I can see from Minister Rivers, I'm eyeballing her up front for the brief period that I was under her. I thought that she had a good understanding of industry and wanted to help it as much as it could. I then moved from there to community affairs. So my eyes were more now under the Premier and Councillor Harris's brief. So I didn't really get a fuller assessment of the entire 4 years of Minister Rivers up close as I would have more so with Minister Panton. And then in terms of the community, I was now at that point no longer a constituent, and I became a constituent of Mr. Harris's. So I hadn't had an up close personal opportunity to assess her workings as a member of parliament for the constituency.
So the answer then is you think she did a good job?
I'm saying I'm not in the best position to assess whether or not she did the best job because at the time I wasn't working directly for her.
Okay. But you are still a member of, where do you live? You actually live in West Bay South, or you're close to West Bay South?
I live in Prospect at the moment.
Oh, you're in Prospect, right? Because you've just gotten back. You did say, right. So you don't think that you can comment on, I mean, it's a bit of an interesting response, because I think at the end of the day, you're no longer civil servant. You could look at her track record as it relates to education, her track record, financial services. We've been blacklisted once, gray listed once under her tenure, but you don't think you're in a position to assess her?
I think that there's always room for improvement. Sorry, I thought the question was more in the capacity of working with her.
No.
Sorry
Just
about
her as a representative.
Yeah, I think that
people and of West Bay South in particular.
I think there were some notable achievements, and I think she was instrumental in the extension of CEDAW. And I think she moved some achievements in terms of gender equality agenda. There are other areas that I think are still opportunities for further advancement and enhancement. And those are some of the things that I'd like to carry forward and pick up the baton and push those forward in terms of financial services and in terms of education and in terms of social services.
Another question that has come in from one of our WhatsApp viewers says, can you ask why I should vote for Andre and I don't even know him? So Andre, a lot of people, how long, we're getting to know you, so give us a little bit of information here. How long were you working as policy advisor? How long were you in that position for?
So that was from 2014 until 2018.
Okay.
Senior Legislative Policy Advisor in Ministry of Financial Services. And then from there, I moved to be a Deputy Chief Officer in Community Affairs. And that was out of a personal passion. I'm not, on that occasion, my wife necessarily wasn't so sympathetic to me putting my applying for that role. She thought perhaps that based on my financial services legislative background, that would be a more comfortable role for me. But I reminded her that my first degree is sociology. And so when I saw the role, it then grabbed me as my first passion. And I went back to thinking about all that can be done for social services. And that role in particular opened my mind to, I think, the issue of mass poverty that we have in the country. It really did blow my mind working with NAU and the social workers to drive by areas every day that we all drive by for work every day and not really have a detailed understanding of how many folks need assistance. I've said this publicly in my capacity as Deputy Chief Officer at a meeting of the Public Accounts Committee, that we have what's known in sociology as either what's called structural or embedded poverty,
Mm-hmm.
where it's generational. And if individuals don't receive a set of wraparound services and we stratify exactly who we consider as poor, what is poor, where is the poverty line, and have a set of wraparound services to identify each challenge, then those folks will be seen by the marketplace as less marketable and continue to get passed by. So we need to come to grips with that, admit it to ourselves as a country, roll our sleeves up, and be able to deal with the underlying root causes of poverty and not just trying to treat the outcomes of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
That was from 2018 until 2019. And then I was asked to put my hat in the ring for the position of the representative to the UK and Europe. And that was from 2019 until last month. Well, last month.
So you said you were asked by whom? By someone in government?
Yeah, it was going to come out, and a couple of folks in government said that this would come out, and we think that you might
Mm-hmm.
be an ideal candidate, among with a few others. It'll be an internal secondment to government, but we think that you're one of the folks that might be able to fit the profile.
Mm-hmm.
And I took a look at the role. I read it. Actually, I'll be very honest with you and your viewers. I wasn't initially convinced. I was wondering whether or not the role would be more so a sort of a social butterfly role in terms of the sort of the conference circuit, the event circuit. But I was convinced before signing that there was a lot more that you can do. And one of the most surprising things, and probably pleasantly surprising things that I discovered was our Caymanian students.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible. We should all know, but it's incredible just what these students are learning. I would argue in my day in studying in the UK, and from most of my peers, there were maybe 5 or 6 disciplines: law, medicine, accounting, banking, marketing, maybe some HR, and maybe a few others. But now these students are into artificial intelligence, they're into computer science, they're into sports medicine, heart surgery, brain surgery. So that's the other aspect that I'm passionate about, is we've got to find a way to let them do their time away so that they can grow and develop and be young folks. But we have to then ensure that we create a fertile environment to attract that brain power back to Cayman so that they be proud and there are opportunities here for them to take the baton and push forward.
Mm-hmm. So a couple questions coming in for you, but let me just ask you, given what you said earlier about, essentially there should be some consequences for behavior, even now without there being a code of conduct in place. Are you prepared going into the election? Say you are successful on April the 14th. And of course, we know that the PPM has indicated that they're out fishing for candidates because they don't have enough to formulate a government. They've indicated that there are a number of people that will be working with them, including, folks like Dwayne Seymour and others. If you are sought after by the PPM and part of their, unity government that they'll be reformulating if they get back in, no doubt will include Mr. Bush, despite the fact that at this time they're claiming that it wouldn't. That seems highly unlikely. Would you be minded to join them, knowing that Mr. Bush will again be in a position of power?
In what position of power?
Well, we don't know. But Mr. Bush
Yes.
doesn't join with anyone, to be quite frank, without there being some benefit to him. So they're going to have to give him something, either ministerial position or Speaker of the House again. And that's just how Mr. Bush rolls. And I think anyone who doesn't understand that is politically naive. So it's a hypothetical question, of course, because it may not play out that way at all. The PPM, even with their desire to work under this coalition manifesto, may not get the numbers that they need. But in the event that that happens, we've asked this question of every single candidate. Where do you lie? Would you be willing to work with Mr. Bush if he was Speaker of the House or a minister as part of a coalition government?
So a couple of things there. One, as you say, it's a hypothetical, and we don't know that it's going to play out that
Yeah.
way. And I would have to, and it would depend on in what capacity Mr. Bush would be
Mhm.
operating in. So
Okay.
I don't think it's, and it also depends on what the other composition of that government would look like. So I'm not prepared to go down a hypothetical question without knowing the full range of facts. I think at the time that the government, what's important now is that the country, because ultimately all the other 18 constituencies are outside of my control.
Mhm.
Ultimately, my advice to viewers is to make the judgment on who you believe is the most qualified person to take an experienced person to take this country forward in your constituency and cast your ballot.
Mhm.
On the day of election, if we wake up, at that time, I'll be working with who I believe is the most effective and combination of ministers, our backbenchers, to take this country forward in a meaningful way and assess the facts at the time on the ground.
Mhm.
I
Okay.
should also make an important point that
Uh-huh.
if no matter whomever is elected in West Bay through all the constituencies of West Bay, if I am elected, we are going to have to work as cross constituency. I don't subscribe to the view that my assistance and responsibility stops at the boundary line of West Bay South. I
Mhm.
subscribe to the view that we'd all have to be working together in that capacity. We're all multi-generational West Bayers, have a bloodline there that we have to work in partnership for the betterment of West Bay. So in that local capacity, I would be willing to work with whomever is returned by all of the West Bay constituencies.
Okay, two simultaneous questions coming in on WhatsApp. I do know that we're going to have another candidate joining us, but we will give him more than ample time. We'll go into overtime. One question says, Andre, let's be honest. If you were not assured a position at Walker's, if you were unsuccessful in the election, would you still have put forward your candidacy? And the other person, quite coincidentally enough, literally a minute before, said, has he been guaranteed a job with Walker's if not successful in the election? So both connected questions. First, has Walker's or any other law firm promised you employment if you're not successful in the political race?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So that negates the other person's question regarding if you hadn't been promised, because I think they were making an assumption that you had been.
No.
Um, yes. Okay. So Lana shares that.
I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm happy to state that I've taken a complete leap of faith that I've left my current job with
Mhm,
no designed backup plan right now.
mhm.
I would not have a plan after the election because I thought I need to do this freely without any other concerns or any other interest. It's the
Right.
only way in my mind to put my fullest foot forward.
Okay. Lana says that you're a politician. um, Vicky says most Bears do not know him. You lived in West Bay before you moved to the UK, Andre?
So I lived in West Bay coming out of university for a
Okay.
few years, and then before marriage. So yes, I
Okay.
lived in the South Safe Haven at first, which was in West Bay South, then Kong Point Road, then Watercourse Road, and then later in Villa Royale on West Bay Road.
Okay.
So when I voted in the 2013 election, I was a registered West Bay voter.
Mhm. So Jonathan gives you some support. He said, I'd vote for Andre in a second over them, over those other guys. My problem is he's not in my constituent. Melody says, good morning, Sandra and Andre. Straight question. Andre, if you were an MP, would you have supported the no confidence motion in regards to the speaker last year? And do you think that the premier acted in the right way by calling an early election?
I think I've answered the first question already. And in relation to the second question, the early election obviously impacts me because I would have liked a longer runway. So for my mind, I would have preferred if all of the voters might have had a longer time to evaluate their candidates.
Yeah. And not just that, but it actually has disenfranchised people, like people who are planning to return home who were in quarantine. Even the Human Rights Commission has issued a statement about that, saying that the elections office now needs to find a way to address that issue because of the short notice that presented itself. So
And even
Joy,
yourself, your folks in media
yeah,
had to scramble to rearrange debate schedules.
so
So
true.
yeah, it was difficult for all of us, I think.
So Andre says, will you comment on two key issues? Number one, government transparency and accountability. And number two, current pace of development and population growth. So let's start with number one, government transparency and accountability.
So accountability goes back to the point I was making about a parliamentary code of conduct. We now are now starting to kick into gear the standards in public life, but I also believe that we need a parliamentary code of conduct. Again, I would refer to call it to the human right, if he's not seen it already, or the emailer to the Human Rights Committee website, Commission's website, if not seen it already, where they've done extensive research on all the different Caribbean countries and the measures that they have in place. I think the most robust model that I saw was Turks and Caicos, where they have a minister's code, and I think they have a parliamentary code, and they also have standards in public life. So I think that is paramount because we're dealing with public funds. Anytime I was ever in a post, whether it was in financial services, whether it was in community affairs, or even in the London office, the first question was, how are we spending the people's money? Is it value for money? And can this stand up under public scrutiny? And you have to be able to issue that information with a straight face without any constraints to the public so that they can see the value for their taxpayer money and how policy is implemented. On the second question, the current pace of development goes back to what I mentioned on Thursday. I think we have to take a step back and create an environmental management framework so that we as a country have a master plan as to how we're going to develop. So let's say, for example, in my proposal that by 2031, we are the regional leader in climate action. What that does is that will compel us to have a developmental framework so that we actually plan and say, this is where we want to be, and let's work backwards from there of how we're going to get there. There'll be certain spaces in which development will be needed and appropriate. And I think a few of the candidates have already come forward with some good ideas in terms of making sure that we plan for the infrastructure and social economic impacts of that development, and make sure you have stakeholder buy-in from all stakeholders. But then there'll be other areas in which it's going to be appropriate to conserve and make sure that we have environmental actions and are ready for climate adaptation. So I think the current growth of development, I think, needs to be looked at, but also more importantly, planned. Where are we going as a country? What would we like seen done? Where do we want to be in, say, 2031 or 2035, and work backwards from there?
Okay. All right. Jonathan feels like the questions are not being answered as forthright as they could be. King does share that when I met Andre briefly when he was in office, attending a networking social, he was genuine in his interests in the Cayman students studying here in the UK. Leon is asking, why is few questions always leading back to Mr. Bush? Sincerely tired of hearing about him. You're not the only one, Leon, but it is sort of a big issue that has been created all because Mr. Bush wouldn't step down. But Leon goes on to say, let's focus on the future changes that are needed rather than the current hype. With or without elections, Mr. Bush's situation will be forgotten in 6 months. Wow. Andre, good luck with West Bay as they believe in who we know, not what you do. Okay. I'm not sure I get that part, but all right. Leon. Brent says, finally, some talk on policy. Sue, I think she's back to the Royals thing, which we have moved on from for quite some time. So it's interesting how people can be so incredibly dismissive of a situation that has impacted not just that particular victim, but an entire country. And in fact, has led us to where we are now with the calling of an early election. But people say, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be forgotten in 6 months. I can't help but wonder if that was his mother or sister that had been assaulted, if he would be feeling so nonchalant about it that, oh, she'll forget it in 6 months, or the country will forget it and move on in 6 months. Quite interesting indeed. Um, Andre, what else can we look forward to in terms of your top issues that you're focusing on?
Sure. I think, well, number one, just to cap that point off, I don't think it should be forgotten about. As I'll reiterate that I think it's a teachable incident for the country that we have to learn from and put procedures in place to make sure it doesn't happen again and that it's not forgotten about. And
Mm-hmm.
there are, I don't think it's the only instance where, as in our history, that we would see regrettable parliamentary conduct. So I think we do need to put more policies and procedures in place to deal with that and not let it be forgotten about. Um, Back to what else I'll be working on. So I've touched on the environment. I've touched on development. I've touched on embedded poverty. I also really want to, as part of the environment, come back and maybe perhaps talk to you about renewable energy.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that now a time has come for our country to now leave fossil fuels and go into renewable energy. One, because it's cheaper
Mm-hmm.
and can assist with cost of living, and two, it could potentially create an industry for jobs. It'll take labor, it'll take person power to add solar panels and create wind farms. And these are jobs that are being expanded in countries all through the G20 and in the UK, where you can train up a whole other set of skill set. It also provides the other part of what I'm working on. It also provides a new image for the island. So many of the UK parliamentarians I would engage with, the EU officials I would engage with, they see us through a particular lens. Even the ones who are favorable to us and trying to defend us see us through a particular lens of financial services and somehow skirting global tax rules. Now, we're doing as much as we can to pass as much legislation as can to convince that, but that's not still shaking that image. To my mind, we need to, with purpose and in earnest, rebrand ourselves in a way that I think that we can rebrand ourselves as the leader of environmental actions in the region. I see no reason why we can't accomplish that fact. That then prevents us in a completely different light and shows some of those countries how we're contributing to the global economy and the global environment in a meaningful way. It also provides an opportunity for our financial services vehicles, and some of this research and work is starting to happen, to show how our investment vehicles that have mastered bringing capital to the market can assist with blue and green projects around the world. So
Mm-hmm.
then those other countries begin to see us not as someone who's squirreling away all of this tax money is what they believe, but actually contributing to the global economy and the global agenda. That could be Cayman's role, to show how because the public purse from around the world, all the countries put together, will not be able to fund green and climate actions by themselves. They're going to need private capital. Our
Mm-hmm.
investment vehicles have mastered bringing that to the market, and they've already started to. We can begin to collect that data and incentivize funds to continue in that path. You then will be looking at across the table for EU officials and other G20 officials to see Cayman in a different light and say, oh, okay, that's how your structures works. That's how they contribute rather than pull money out of our economy. It then provides us a whole other chapter in our history. So I would strongly advocate for us to build around a green and blue economy, which will help with cost of living, help with job creation, and help with image.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that should answer Brent's question about energy cost. Darlene shares, with no disrespect, the South, North, West, and East does not matter. All the Indigenous Caymanians are family. With that will include, missing something here, with which that will include of the constituencies in the Cayman Islands. Not quite sure, Darlene, I get that. Tommy says, if I were a West Bay South constituent, I would vote for Andre Ebanks. He's the better candidate for West Bay South. His hard work ethic and integrity is what is needed, and he will work from day one for Cayman to continue to be the best place in the world. He will work hard for the best interests and results of everyone in Cayman. I do think your particular constituency, Andre, is going to be very, very interesting. especially now that Tara is no longer in the race. It's a two-man race. And in many respects, you and Raul have a lot of similarities in the sense that you're both professionals, qualified. He was obviously in the telecom industry, having been a CEO at Digicel, and he's also a small business owner. But I think your race is going to be one to watch for sure. Darlene says, I believe Andre has a lot to offer. All the best. Good morning, Nancy. Ray says that Andre is very capable and smart person. I wouldn't hesitate voting for him if I could. His great work in the UK for us is an example of this. Give us an idea of what you were up to in the UK. I know you were only there for a short period of time, but what are some of your achievements while you were in that position?
Well, it's a tour of two tales.
Mm-hmm.
COVID, pre-COVID, and then post-COVID. Pre-COVID, I think the role followed its normal pattern, where you're representing Cayman among the other sister overseas territories, as well as in front of parliamentarians, and then assisting with business development and assisting the local London stakeholders know more about Cayman so they can support Cayman.
Mm-hmm.
Post-COVID is a totally different tour and a unique set of challenges that I don't think the office, just by me being there at the particular time, ever faced.
Mm-hmm.
So before COVID got started, we were put on the EU tax blacklist. That London is, as you would appreciate, a financial services center just like New York. There's a lot of, not Cayman, because a lot of Cayman firms have offices in London. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual firms that instruct our firms. A lot of people that had to be talked through what happened and what's the action plan to get off. So that took rounds of meetings with the Ministry of Financial Services, London stakeholders, EU officials to try to work through a plan for the country to successfully get off, and it did. But while that was going on, COVID obviously hit. COVID presented a whole other range of challenges because the Caymanians overseas are far larger than just the students. The students are there and they're hugely important, but you not only have the government scholarship students, you have those who are there who are privately funded or private scholarships. You have young Caymanian professionals who have already gone on to get the degree or are out there working. You have Caymanian pensioners who decided to retire. In the UK, it gave the office unprecedented insight as to who exactly from Cayman is in the UK and also in wider Europe. It was a challenging time initially because first the borders were closed. You had Caymanians not just trapped who needed to get home in the UK and Europe, they were as far flung as Asia. They were as far flung as Australia, all calling, how are we going to get back home?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that required negotiation, not just with UK border control, but border control and airlines from many different international countries to try to get Caymanians home. In addition to that, you would remember that there would be rounds of negotiations with British BA in order to have these flights arranged, coordinate who was going to be able to on those flights. A couple of the first flights were shared by the other overseas territories. So it took negotiation with the other overseas territories to work out how many seats would be apportioned in the plane for each of our citizens, because everybody wanted to get home. And how do you decide who's urgent? So we had to come up with sort of a tier of this person is screaming urgent, this person is urgent, and this one is important, because they were all important. But some situations you had folks who had already given up their tenancy, had nowhere to go because they thought they were done with school and were moving house and were coming back to Cayman and had nowhere to go. They had to come home. So it was a very intense and a very fast-paced time where critical decisions needed to be made. It had to be cross-department coordination with the Foreign Office and also with a number of Cayman civil service departments to get people home. And then in addition to that, all the overseas territories reps had to study for each territory the impact of Brexit. So while you have EU tax going on, you have COVID going on, you're also now having to study how the country is going to be impacted by Brexit. Fortunately for Cayman, we have more of a service economy. and we're not trading hard goods. So we were not as impacted by Brexit. We had to keep our eye on the travel between Europe because this would be different. The travel restrictions and visas that students could go across the border as freely would have ended. But outside of that, we were somewhat spared, unlike some of the other overseas territories who actually sell products into the EU. But still, it required attention and coordination to detail to figure out and advise the government of how we would prepare for that scenario. So all of that was done in lockdown because we closed the office from March of 2020 because we all said as an office, as the 12 individuals that are there, if we all get sick and get COVID, then we can't help anybody else. So we all had to work in dealing with these complex issues from home. And I'd shout out my former colleagues in the London office to not make it look like it was just me. I couldn't have done it without them. Philippa Knights, Dennison Miller, Rahad Siddiqui, Charles Parchment, a very loyal deputy, long-standing institutional knowledge of the London office, and the folks that make up the Department of Tourism's team. Couldn't have done it without them. And there are moments of service there and bonds that have been forged we just will never forget, because you don't know until you're under a pressure cooker like that how you'll react. And I was very proud of the work that we did together.
Thank you for that, Andre. Cherie, good morning. Says Cayman can be a leading light in the green and blue space. We can lead in ensuring disclosures on ESG for all regulated entities in Cayman. This is a very big deal now.
I think she's right. I think she's right about that. It's the kind of thing you look forward in 10 years. If we pull this off, it's the kind of thing that whomever's premier gets invited to the UN to speak. It really could change things.
You know what is so amazing though? Cayman, given our current population size, I know one of the questions earlier was about population development and growth. We, I think, are placed in such a unique position, especially because of COVID. We now have the ability to step back and have a little bit more time unencumbered by the rush of trying to make the tourism dollar, which I know is obviously impacting some families. But I think that gives us an opportunity to dial back and focus on some key areas and try to fix some major problem areas, including education, healthcare, traffic, and other things, while we don't have, a million people on our shores in the next 12 months. What is your vision for how we could possibly use the opportunity presented by the pandemic to address areas of major concern?
I think it's all related. I think it's all connected. We do have to use this opportunity and not squander this time where certain things are paused, and you do some. And I don't know that it requires much analysis, because I don't want us to get into a situation where we have to engage in 2 years of studies. There are a number of studies that are sitting on the shelf that need to be implemented, that all it takes is like-minded folks with the will, and there'll have to be some consultation. Things will need to be appropriately updated, but we don't have to spend 2 years working on this. There are a number of plans that are sitting on a shelf in community affairs. There are a number of plans that are sitting on a shelf in education. There are a number of plans that are sitting on a shelf. The environmental policy, I think there's a 2011 environmental policy that has yet to be fully implemented. So fast forward 10 years, yes, it will have to have appropriate modifications, but they're not hard to do. And once we have those policy frameworks in place, appropriately update them, there's nothing that this country can't achieve.
Thank you so much. Andre, just a few more points. Brent says, overseas uni student here. While I appreciate the line of questions about the character of other MPs, I think, Brent, it's bigger than that, but okay. I've seen little about policy, and it makes my job as a citizen harder to cast my vote. I would appreciate in-depth policy discussions for candidates to help with my decision. By the way, Brent, speaking of that, let me do a shameless plug here. We are actually going to be giving candidates an opportunity to come on our platform. These will be recorded sessions, but then we're going to push them through as live. And they will speak on 10 key areas of policy, and no questions asked, no interruptions. They just get to speak on, what they see as areas of concern relating to those, and also what their solutions are for those key areas. So I'm going to pull up what they are. I remember most of them from memory, but so that I don't forget any, let me tell you what they are. So this is going to be the speakeasy segments. education, employment, development, cost of living, traffic management, the environment, healthcare, tourism recovery, the pandemic, and political accountability. And I think the last one is where those questions stem from this morning. So hopefully, Brent, you appreciate the bigger picture of political accountability. Darlene says, with no disrespect, Andre's Ebanks' father is an Indigenous Caymanian in West Bear. Maybe your people should ask Andre who his daddy is. Okay, well, who your daddy is?
Atlee Ebanks, former manager of Andy's Rent-A-Car, and prior to that, he was in banking.
Okay. And she says most of our Indigenous Caymanians like to vote for who give them during election time. Once they do not care what happens to the country. A bunch of sellouts until death do them part. Such a sad situation. Well, again, speaks to the integrity of who we elect, and whether or not they feel that is a necessity to get voted into politics. That ongoing situation, Darlene, is, as you know, I see a lot of there've been some memes about it over the past week or two. People putting up on EK, for example, $3,500 for my vote, or give me, down payment on a house. And I know people are by and large joking, but the fact that we could even joke about blatant bribery of our elected officials, and that people know they're taking these bribes to vote for people who aren't necessarily the better option or the best options for this community, is really quite shocking. And I think it is interesting that we, find it funny even. So Edmund says, hypothetical, if you were a GTC voter, would you support Kenneth Bryan as a representative for a ministry, and why? So lots of hypotheticals here.
I can't answer that. I'm not a GTC voter, so I don't have the experience with him as being my representative. But I think that I can answer this way, from my view of him in the Legislative Assembly, sitting across from him as a policy advisor, I found him to provide thoughtful questions. Mm-hmm. I think he and I were aligned in relation to housing. We had some engaging discussions on housing. I think he and I, we sat down, and we one session we had in my role as deputy chief officer, we had a session where we discussed it, and he had really intimate knowledge of how to address it. And we were in agreement that it wouldn't be helpful to have just say one compound. What you would want, which goes along with us being Caymankind and goes along with sociological studies, is to have a range of different social housing dispersed through the island, carefully planned, which goes back to the master planning of development. It's all connected. And then having a set of wraparound services, whether the person struggles with just a job and just needs sort of either interviewing skills or resume writing skills, to whether or not there's a deeper problem area, and structure it and categorize it in a way that the wraparound services address that person and get people back up and running to work. And in relation to folks who are homeowners, who don't need the rent or the housing, but need their roofs repaired. He was quite sympathetic and instrumental to the push when we had a session, I think in early 2019, to add to the budget, to supplement that budget for more homes to be repaired. So I found him, in my capacity as an advisor working in community affairs, to be very engaged and to be very knowledgeable on areas of social assistance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Lena says, thank you, Andre. Enjoyed listening. Appreciate your vision. All the best. Shireen says, great interview. We're going to wrap things up here now with Andre. Louis says, go solo, Cayman. Pay yourselves and support your local ham radio operators, etc. Everyone in the community are important, from the garbage collectors to the seniors, and they all have a voice, CMR, and an important role in our communities. So vote smart and vote for change. Andre, thank you. We really appreciate you coming on to the program today. All the best of luck with your campaign. I'm sure that we will have an opportunity to speak with you again between now and May the 14th, another 5 weeks or so. And I think you're ready to go out there and do what you got to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to your viewers. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, my dear. So folks, that was Andre Ebanks vying for